close your eyes for a moment and let me take you somewhere the air tastes like salt and iron. Imagine you're standing at the edge of the known world, not the map world, but the lived world of men who measure distance by how long a mule can walk before its hooves split, who read seasons in the smell of river mud, and who think the gods might be listening when the wind shifts. You and I are going back to Greece in the early 5th century BCE, to the age of King Leonidas of Sparta, when the word freedom didn't mean comfort, it meant the right to govern your own land and bury your own dead. You'll feel the geography before you understand it. The sharp spine of the Taygetus Mountains cutting the sky, the Eurotas River threading green through a hard valley, the Aegean glittering like a blade. You'll hear the discipline of Sparta in simple sounds: sandals on stone, shields being tested, a chorus of boys chanting in the training yards. And then, from the north, you'll sense a pressure building like a storm. Persia, the largest empire anyone in the Greek world has ever imagined, moving toward them with roads, horses, ships, and sheer inevitability. This is not a legend told from marble statues. This is what it feels like to be there. What I would see, what I would smell, what I would learn from the terrain itself, and what it costs to hold a narrow pass against a force that believes history already belongs to it. If you stay with me through these 4 chapters, you won't just hear about Thermopylae. You'll stand in it. Quick note before we begin. YouTube, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, subscribe now and hit like on this video. It genuinely helps me keep making stories like this, and if you want the next chapter and the next journey, I need you with me now. Come closer. Let's go. Chapter 1. Sparta, the valley that makes men. If I lived in Leonidas's time, the first thing I'd understand is that Sparta isn't just a city. It's a landscape that trains you. Sparta sits inland, away from the sea, in the Eurotas Valley. On one side, the Taygetus Range rises like a wall, dark, steep, and unforgiving. On the other side, lower ridges and hills funnel movement like a hand guiding a blade. The Eurotas River runs through the valley, not a roaring river, but steady, enough to green the banks, feed orchards, and give life to a place that otherwise feels carved from sun-baked stone. And that matters, because Sparta's power doesn't come from trade ships or busy harbors. It comes from land and from controlling the people who work it. You would see 3 layers of Spartan society almost immediately. First, the Spartans themselves, the citizens, the equals, who train and fight. Second, the perioikoi, free people in surrounding towns, craftsmen and traders who keep the economy breathing. And third, the helots, the enslaved population bound to the land, producing the grain and olives that feed the warrior class. If I were there, I'd feel the tension of that arrangement everywhere. Sparta's strength is built on discipline, and discipline is built on fear. Fear of external enemies, yes, but also fear of uprising from within. Now picture the training grounds, the agog. You'd hear boys chanting in rhythm, practicing footwork, learning to hold formation. They're taught endurance the way other places teach reading. They learn to fight as a unit, because in Greek warfare, survival often comes down to whether the man to your left holds his shield line. I would walk the city and notice what's missing, the kind of ornament and luxury you'd see in Athens or Corinth. Sparta isn't poor. Sparta is intentionally restrained. Wealth is seen as a corrosive softness. The public meals, the syssitia, aren't just eating. They're political glue, men sit together, share simple food, and absorb the idea that the group comes first. And above it all, there's the peculiar Spartan government, 2 kings, elders, and overseers. Leonidas isn't a lone absolute ruler. He's part of a system designed to prevent any one man from becoming too powerful and to keep the military machine stable over generations. If I were living there, I'd realize quickly that Leonidas's authority is respected not because he's feared, but because he embodies the state's ideals. But here's what would haunt me. Sparta knows something is coming. In the years leading into the Persian invasion, the Greek world is fragmented. City-states jealous of one another, alliances shifting, rivalries deep. Yet Persia has already proved its reach. For the Greeks, the Persian Empire isn't an abstract threat. It's a machine that has conquered kingdoms, drawn borders, and demanded earth and water as symbols of submission. You'd hear stories in Sparta about Persia's vastness, about the way their armies move with engineers and supplies, about their cavalry and archers. You'd also hear something else, confidence, almost stubborn. Spartans believe the line can hold if the line is disciplined. They trust the logic of the phalanx and the courage of men trained to die without panic. If I were there the night before leaving Sparta, I would stand outside the city where the valley opened slightly and look north. The air would feel still, and I would know that the mountains and passes ahead aren't just geography. They're decisions, routes of invasion, places where history narrows. And then the call would come to Thermopylae, not because it's glorious, but because it's practical. Because Thermopylae is a choke point, the kind of place where a smaller force can shape the battlefield into a weapon. And Leonidas is the kind of man who understands that terrain is fate. Chapter 2, The Road to Thermopylae. Where Greece becomes a single breath travel in that era isn't a straight line on a map. It's a negotiation with the land. If I went with Leonidas's force, I'd feel the shift as we left the Eurotas Valley. The ground changes. The wide Spartan basin gives way to foothills and rougher tracks. We pass through allied territories and neutral ones, each with their own politics, each calculating what Persia's arrival will mean. Some places will resist, some will submit. Most will hesitate until it's too late. You'd notice how information moves slowly through messengers and rumor. A report might be a week old by the time it reaches a council, and yet everyone knows the direction of the storm from the north and east, from the coastlines and the mountain routes. Thermopylae itself, when you finally approach it, feels like the earth has deliberately pinched shut. On one side are mountains, steep slopes that rise fast, covered with scrub and rock. On the other side is the sea, the Malayak Gulf, pressing in close. In places, the usable land between mountain and water becomes so narrow that an army can't spread out. It's not a dramatic canyon, it's a constriction. A hot gate, named for the natural hot springs in the area where sulfur and steam mark the land like a warning. And that's where the Greek strategy makes sense. Persia is huge, but huge forces need space. They need room to deploy cavalry, to outflank, to use their numbers. Thermopylae denies them that. It turns the war into a contest of endurance and discipline at arm's length. When I imagine arriving, I see not one Greek army, but a patchwork. Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and others, each contingent with its own pride. The unity is real, but fragile. They share a purpose while disagreeing about everything else. Some are there out of conviction. Some are there because if Thermopylae falls, their cities will be next. And then there's the sea. Because Thermopylae isn't a single battle plan. It's paired with the naval position at Artemisium, where Greek ships try to hold the Persian fleet and prevent it from outflanking the land defense. You would feel that interconnectedness if you were there. The land army's success depends on the sea's success and vice versa. The Greeks are not just fighting Persia, they are fighting the geometry of the invasion. Now, picture the Persian approach. It's not merely soldiers, it's logistics, a moving world. Their army includes archers, infantry, elite units, cavalry, and support personnel. Their fleet runs parallel along the coast. They've crossed into Greece with the confidence of an empire that assumes resistance will crumble under pressure. If I stood at Thermopylae waiting, I'd feel something that isn't in the statues: time. Waiting is part of warfare. Waiting while scouts report. Waiting while officers argue over placements. Waiting while men sharpen weapons they've already sharpened just to keep their hands steady. Waiting while the horizon remains empty until it doesn't. And when the first Persian presence becomes visible, dust, glints of metal, movement like a tide, the reality would land in your chest. This is not a raid, not a border skirmish. This is an empire arriving to rewrite the map. And Leonidas would walk among his men with the calm of someone who has already accepted the cost. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady, as if the pass itself has spoken and he's answering. Chapter 3. The Hot Gates. How a narrow place becomes immortal. You need to understand the fighting at Thermopylae as physics. In a narrow pass, the front line is everything. A Greek hoplite's shield overlaps the next man's shield. Spears project forward. The goal is not heroic individual duels, it's cohesion. The phalanx is a living wall with teeth. If I were there, I would notice the ground underfoot. Packed earth, stone, uneven footing near the edges, the smell of the hot springs sometimes drifting in on the wind. I would feel the heat in my armor and the salt air from the Gulf. And I would hear the most important sound of the battle, not screams, but the constant brutal percussion of impact. Shield against shield, spear hafts striking, armor scraping, the heavy breathing of men trying not to break rhythm. The Persians would test the line. They would push infantry forward, believing numbers can solve anything. But at the narrowest points, numbers become a liability. Their back ranks press on the front ranks, compressing them into a killing zone where they can't maneuver. The Greeks rotate their fighters. That's crucial. A disciplined force can trade exhausted frontline men for fresher ones without the line collapsing. Sparta's training shines here, not as mythology, but as procedure. And then there are the Persian arrows, so many that later stories will say they darkened the sky. The reality, if I'm honest, is less poetic and more terrifying. The hiss of volleys, the thuds as shafts strike shields and ground, the instinct to flinch and the training to resist that instinct. In a formation, flinching opens gaps. Gaps kill. Days blur into repeated violence and calculation. The Persians would likely try different units, including elite troops, attempting to crack the Greek center through force and intimidation. The Greeks hold because the pass lets them. It is geography acting as a multiplier. But Thermopylae has a flaw, and it's the kind of flaw that only matters when someone tells the enemy where to look. There is a mountain path, a route around the pass. It's not easy, but it exists. If the Persians can move troops along it, the Greek position becomes a trap. Suddenly, the narrow gate that protects you becomes a narrow gate you can't escape. And that's the moment where history shifts from tactics to choice. When Leonidas learns the position is compromised, the story isn't simply they fought to the last. The real question is, what do you do when the battle is no longer about victory but about time? If I were there, I would watch Leonidas make the decision that defines him: to stay and hold the pass as long as possible, buying time for other Greeks to prepare, time for cities to evacuate, time for alliances to solidify, time for the war to continue, on terms that aren't dictated entirely by Persia. Some forces depart. That's not cowardice. That's strategy. A war is not won by dying in the right place. It's won by surviving long enough to keep fighting. But Leonidas and his corps remain, and the atmosphere changes. The men who stay are no longer measuring success in yards gained or lost. They're measuring it in minutes. The final stand becomes a compression of everything: discipline, belief, exhaustion, and an acceptance that feels almost quiet. If you ask me what I would remember most, it wouldn't be a single dramatic moment. It would be the human scale details. A man tightening his grip because his fingers are numb, another adjusting a strap with a calm that feels unreal. The way voices lower when everyone understands the end is close. And when the Persians attack from both sides, the pass becomes a furnace. The Greeks fight in a shrinking pocket of space, shields dented, spears broken, switching to shorter weapons as the crush intensifies. Leonidas dies there, one life amid thousands, but his death carries weight because it's not accidental. It's aligned with the purpose of the stand, to demonstrate that the empire's victory will not be cheap, not easy, not psychologically inevitable. Thermopylae becomes a message written in terrain and blood. Greece can be invaded, but it cannot be simply swallowed. Chapter 4. After Thermopylae, the echo that wins wars. Here's the part most people skip: what happens after the pass falls. If I survived, maybe as an assigned runner, maybe injured and sent back, maybe attached to Allied forces, what I'd carry isn't triumph, it's urgency. Thermopylae is not the end, it's a signal flare. In the weeks after, Greece would feel like a house with doors kicked in. Some cities would panic. Some would accuse others of betrayal. Some would finally commit to resistance because the cost of submission is suddenly visible. The Persians push forward. Athens, famously, faces evacuation and destruction. The war shifts from mountain choke points to harbors, islands, and straits. The naval struggle becomes decisive because ships can move where armies can't, striking supply lines and controlling movement along the coast. And here's the strategic truth: Thermopylae's sacrifice matters because it feeds the narrative spine of resistance. When people know someone held the line against impossible odds, it changes what they believe is achievable. Morale isn't decoration, it's a military resource. Over time, the Greeks regroup. They exploit what Persia struggles with far from home: long supply lines, cultural distance, the challenge of controlling fiercely independent city-states that refuse to think like provinces. Eventually, major engagements on sea and land reshape the campaign. The Greeks prove they can win, not just endure. Thermopylae becomes part of a larger sequence, a defensive stand that buys time, followed by strategic consolidation, followed by decisive battles that punish the invaders' overreach. And Leonidas? He becomes more than a king, If I walked back through Greece later, I'd see how places hold memory. A hill becomes a story. A pass becomes a lesson. People repeat the names of those who stayed, Spartans, Thespians, and others, because remembering is a form of resistance too. I would likely stand at Thermopylae again, long after the bodies are gone, and notice how ordinary it can look when the wind is calm. The sea still glitters, the mountains still loom, the hot springs still steam, and yet the air would feel different because you'd know what happened. There wasn't about the pass itself. It was about the idea that a small coalition of cities could refuse imperial gravity. If you lived there with me, you'd understand something sobering. History doesn't always turn on the biggest armies. Sometimes it turns on the narrow places, geographic and moral, where people decide what they are willing to lose in order to remain themselves. That is what Leonidas's era would teach you in the most physical way possible. Freedom is not a slogan. It is logistics, terrain, discipline, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to let someone else define your future. And once you've seen that up close, you never hear the word Thermopylae the same way again. Closing, YouTube. If you made it to the end, thank you for being here. Subscribe if you haven't, and don't forget to like the video. Your support is what lets me keep making documentary-style stories like this. Tell me in the comments which era you want to travel to next.